My name is Ethan Cole. I'm 39 years old, living in a quiet suburb just outside of Seattle. I own a small architecture firm, nothing fancy, but enough to keep me comfortable and proud. For most of my adult life, I've considered myself a practical man. I don't chase excitement, I don't gamble, and I never believed in fate until I met her. Her name was Lauren Hale. She was 31 when we met, smart, disarmingly confident, and beautiful in a way that didn't need to ask for attention. I met her at a client's launch event 3 years ago. I remember that night like it's engraved behind my eyelids. She laughed at one of my sarcastic comments, then said, "You look like a man who carries too much in his head." I told her she wasn't wrong. By the end of that night, I'd given her my number. And for the first time in years, I drove home smiling. Lauren worked in marketing for a tech company called Vector's, a sleek, ambitious place full of people who spoke in buzzwords and deadlines. I didn't care much for that world, but she thrived in it. She was sharp, quick, and always moving. That was part of what drew me to her, the energy, the drive. I thought we balanced each other out, my calm to her chaos, her spark to my stillness. For a while, everything was perfect. Weekend hikes, wine by the fireplace, her head resting on my chest as she talked about her dreams of starting her own firm. I'd never had that kind of peace before, not the lazy, fragile kind, but something real, something that felt like home. I told myself she was the one. I even started looking at engagement rings. That's how far gone I was. Then the cracks began to show. It started small. Late nights at work that stretched longer each week. Texts she didn't answer until morning. A new perfume she said was a gift from a friend, the kind of signs you don't want to notice, but your gut does. I told myself she was just busy. I wanted to trust her. God, I really did. But truth has a way of bleeding through no matter how much you try to bandage it. One night, around 11:30, I called her. It rang twice and went to voicemail. I sent a quick "You okay?" text, no reply. I tried again at midnight, same result. That's when I did something I'd never done before. I opened her Find My iPhone location. She'd shared it months ago when she once got lost hiking. I'd forgotten I even had access. She wasn't at work. She wasn't home. Her phone was pinging from a hotel downtown. I remember sitting on the edge of my bed, staring at that blinking blue dot. My mouth went dry. I waited. 10 minutes, 20, then I grabbed my jacket and keys. I didn't have a plane, just a pulse full of anger and disbelief. The hotel was one of those sleek business types, glass lobby, quiet music, the smell of disinfectant, and money. I walked in like I belonged there. Asked the front desk if Ms. Hale had checked in. They couldn't tell me that, of course. Privacy policies. But I already knew. I took the elevator up, floor by floor, until I found her car parked in the garage. I waited in that car for 47 minutes. 47. Every second grinding into my ribs. Then they appeared. Lauren and Mark Keller, her colleague. I'd met him once at a networking event, a guy with perfect teeth and the kind of fake charm that screams insecurity. They walked out of the elevator together, laughing, his hand on her lower back. They kissed in the middle of the parking lot. Not a quick, guilty kiss. A slow, deliberate one. The kind of kiss that says, "We've done this before." I didn't confront them. Not that night. I just watched, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. When they drove off, I followed. Not close, just enough. I watched them stop at a diner, then his apartment. Watch her disappear inside like it was nothing. When I got home, I sat in the dark for hours. My phone buzzed around 2 a.m. A message from her. "Sorry, crazy night at work. Fell asleep at the office. Love you." That was the moment something inside me snapped. Not in rage. Not yet. It was colder than that, like a quiet decision being made behind my ribs. I wasn't going to scream or beg or ask why. I was going to destroy them, carefully, methodically, the same way I designed buildings. Every detail precise, every angle planned. The next morning, I smiled at her like nothing was wrong, made her coffee, kissed her forehead. She smiled back, and suspecting, she thought she was in control of the story. She had no idea the ending was already written. I started gathering everything: text logs, photos, emails. I knew where she worked, who her boss was, what clients she managed. I knew about the upcoming Vector's campaign, one that could make or break her department. And Mark, he was in charge of the budget reports. Convenient. For 3 weeks, I became an actor in my own life, pretending to love her, pretending to trust her, pretending to be blind. Every night I'd lie beside her, counting her breaths, listening to her talk about work, about him, about nothing. And in that silence, I built a plan. By the time she realized something was wrong, it would already be too late. People think revenge is about anger. It's not. It's about precision, about balance, about making sure the scales don't just even out, they tilt so far the other way that the ones who wronged you never find their footing again. I used to believe love was the strongest force in the world. Now I know it's the quiet rage of a betrayed man. And this was only the beginning. I told myself from the start I wouldn't be sloppy. Sloppiness is what gives people a chance to apologize, to beg, to slip back into your life with a half-truth and a rehearsed look of remorse. I had seen that movie before: men on their knees, faces wet, promises poured out like cheap wine, and it always ended the same. The wounded man taking one more hit because the wound had a voice that sounded like love. So I became something I had never been before, an observer. I stopped imagining grand gestures, no threats screened in bars, no confrontation under kitchen lights. I collected things, little things, proofs that could be handed to strangers and still look like the whole truth. Receipts, screenshots, times and locations, a slow accumulation of facts that, when arranged, made a picture impossible to deny. I traced their patterns. When Lauren said she worked late, what did that mean exactly? Which meetings, which clients, which conference rooms had keycard logs? Vector's prided itself on security and documentation, an HR manager's dream. I started with that, the mundane bureaucracy of modern work. I requested, without arousing suspicion, copies of the campaign timelines she'd been assigned. As an architecture client, I had professional reasons to ask for it, some details about their marketing rollout. They complied. A simple email, a polite tone, no alarm bells. Mark, on the other hand, was an open flame. He made mistakes he would later call oversights. He posted pictures with Lauren on social media in a way that suggested a casualness I learned to exploit. He bragged about lunches and late nights and messages to colleagues. He was loud enough that people listened. That was useful. The loud ones always left footprints. I bought a cheap voice recorder, and my first night of research was to simply be awake. I learned the rhythm of their relationship. How often Lauren left for rehearsed client dinners. How Mark drove to a parking lot 2 blocks away to take a call. How their text timestamps told a story that phone words alone could not. I stayed precise. Never violent, never messy. I documented. But documentation without leverage is just a scrapbook. I needed leverage, something that would not only expose them, but would turn the world they existed in it. Oh, quicksand. One of the deadliest weapons in a city of commerce is reputation. People like Lauren and Mark live by it. Promotions, presentations, client lunches, status updates. Take that away and there's nothing left for them to sell. I started with the easiest, most human place to attack, the workplace. Vector's was about to launch a major healthcare campaign. Lauren was presenting the creative concepts to a panel of investors and a potential hospital chain that could make her career. I knew the dates. I knew the people. I knew the thing they feared most: failure in front of people who mattered. I slowly fed the company the right kind of oxygen: anonymous, factual notes. Have you audited the recent budget reports for the Hale account? There are inconsistencies in Mark Keller's expense filings. I phrased everything like a concerned colleague, not an enraged lover. People take internal notes seriously. Companies live in a world of red flags and compliance checks. HR, legal, and finance all start to move when a tiny whisper smells of danger. But whispers alone are brittle. They needed weight. That's where the detective part of me clicked into place, the part that loved pattern recognition more than confrontation. When I worked on building designs, a single misaligned joist would reveal itself under stress. So I looked for structural weaknesses in their professional framework. Mark handled the budget entries for small vendor contracts. He had access to client funds, signed off on expense approvals, and a taste for off-the-books favors. At first it was a hunch, an odd line item in a publicly available contractors list, and then, in the archive of old marketing decks I had accidentally been sent, I found a string of reimbursements routed through a shell company. The shell company was registered under a name that included Mark's middle initial. Coincidence maybe, but in these cities coincidences are doors. You push them and see what falls out. I did not hack anything. I did not break into computers. I used open sources, public filings, and the kind of old-fashioned legwork I had once relied on to scout building sites. I called a former supplier, asked casually about payments from Vectorus to Hilver Consulting. The man confirmed offhand, paid last quarter. Names lined up in the margins. Numbers matched. When I passed this to HR as concerns about budget irregularities, it stopped being my private poison and became their corporate problem. While the company's compliance team started to scratch at that vein, I tightened the social news. You underestimate how quickly a well-placed rumor travels inside a glass office tower. I didn't spread lies. I spread a version of the truth tailored to fit speculation. To the junior account managers, I left a printed page in internal memo about policy compliance left on a copy machine in the marketing wing. It was a mundane document with a margin note that hinted someone had already flagged Mark's folders. People read it and began noticing things they hadn't before. The way Mark signed off trips, the lunch receipts that didn't add up. Small minds make big mountains of small stones. All the while, at home, I kept the performance intact. I kissed Lauren, I made coffee, I listened to her tell me about client milestones. It felt sickening and exquisite at once, like rehearsing for a funeral while people still breathe. I learned the art of understatement, asking about her day in a tone that implied nothing. So she would volunteer the most damning details on her own. She spoke of unexpected audits like someone reading line items off a grocery list. Her voice was casual. That is what kills you, the ordinary voice delivering extraordinary betrayal. One evening, a card she had left in my wallet fell open to a tweet she had screenshot. Big wins tonight, patient first health campaign, watch this space. Underneath, Mark had commented something like, couldn't have done it without you, a punctuation mark that felt like a thumb in my chest. I kept the screenshot. I archived every digital breadcrumb. It would matter. Then came the timing. I do not believe in haste. Revenge, like architecture, required sequencing. The compliance probe needed oxygen and public attention at the same time that the clients needed to feel insecure. I arranged both. I sent one carefully worded, anonymous email to a key hospital procurement officer, someone who could torpedo the Vector's pitch with a single query. The email hinted that budget approvals and expense allocations in the Hale account had been irregular and suggested they do a thorough review before signing anything. The subject line was bland, the wording polite. It looked like an overcautious buyer, not a saboteur. The procurement officer called their legal counsel the next morning. Vector's panicked. They canceled the final pitch meeting, citing a need to reconcile internal finances. Lauren called me in a panic. Her voice was sharp, precise, and terrified. She blamed Mark in a way that made it sound like someone else had set the fire she had been standing in. I did not answer. When Vector's froze, HR widened its net. They suspended Mark pending an audit. They asked Lauren for a written statement. The company posted a freeze on certain client interactions. Rumors swelled like a storm front. Careers can soak up water for a while, but in the end they either sink or find drier ground. In the hallway outside the building where we had once celebrated her promotion, I watched Lauren get escorted by an HR manager. She looked at me one size searching for salvation, and I gave her none. The look she gave was not one of fury but of confusion, as if someone had switched the script on her and left her to improvise. She mouthed my name. My lips did not move, but I had not yet taken the final step. Exposure alone leaves room for apology. It leaves room for the narrative of human error. I needed certainty that they would not recover. That required a second, subtler move, the slow erosion of allies. I called anonymously the one reporter who had once written a piece on corporate malfeasance in our city. I did not leak the affair. That would have felt petty and personal. I fed them the budget trail, the show company name, the invoice numbers. I attached a photo I had taken Mark at his laptop, hands on the keyboard, a glance that could not be explained by innocence. The reporter, smelling a story that could smell like greed and scandal, began poking. While the media starter kit warmed in a small churn, I turned to client relationships. I called one of Vectrus's smaller clients, a regional clinic that relied on honesty and, under the guise of concern over recently noticed irregularities, suggested they require immediate reconciliation before any further work. The client pulled their contract. The loss trickled upward. If one clinic pulls, others ask uncomfortable questions. If the launch stalls, investors frown. If investors frown, HR demands answers. A cascade, then at first, then unstoppable. The key to all of it was plausibility. Everything I did could be rationalized as due diligence, no threats, no violence, no blackmail, just precise, legal pressure applied in places that mattered. I had seen buildings fall from the top when the foundation trembled. I would do the same for them. Still, there is a line between tactical coldness and something uglier. Sometimes, late at night, I would catch myself imagining what the fall would look like. Lauren watching clients delete her contact, Mark answering to a boardroom of ice-cold faces. For a moment I would tilt the scale in my mind toward mercy and then, just as quickly, push it back. Mercy is what lets people keep living as if nothing had happened. I wanted them to understand the weight of what they'd done. Something else happened during those weeks, something I did not plan. As the company's net closed in on Mark, small murmurs started to slide toward Lauren in a way I had not anticipated. People do not separate private actions from public ones the way corporate compliance does. Once suspicion took hold, colleagues who had once smiled across desks began to treat her like a contagion. Invitations dried up. Lunches stopped. Her calendar, once full of client meetings, opened like a throat with no sound inside. One night Lauren came home with silicone under her eyes and a handshake for the kettle I had left on. She asked me flatly, Did you tell someone?" Her voice was small. I stood in the kitchen with the steam of the kettle fogging my glasses, and I told her the truth in a way she hadn't expected. Not confession, but clarity. "Someone did," I said. "Someone found the right places to look." She laughed, then a thin sound that could have been a sob. "You think you know everything, don't you?" she said. "You think you can unravel me with spreadsheets and late-night investigations." Maybe she was right. Maybe I did think I could know everything. I had never been good at ambiguity. It made me nervous. So I learned to reframe uncertainty as a problem to solve. "Do you think you can fix it?" she asked. I let the silence answer. That silence did more damage than any accusation. Because, in that quiet, she understood that the thing she valued, her reputation, her career, was now a thing she could lose. And that the man she had been sleeping next to would not be moved by her panic. And that, maybe, is the cruelest part. When the person you love ceases to be someone who pleads for you and becomes someone who watches you with the coldness of someone cataloging evidence. The dominoes started to fall in public the following week. A finance magazine picked up the story. An internal memo leaked about an ongoing investigation. Mark was placed on leave. Lauren was asked to turn in her hardware for the duration of the audit. Colleagues shifted their conversations to the emptiness left on their calendars. I watched it all happen from the window of our living room like a man watching an old house burn in the rain. But as they sank under the weight of corporate scrutiny, something unknown to me shifted the stakes. Walking through the rubble of their careers, I found a new piece of information, unexpected, ugly, and potentially lethal. In the same set of invoices that implicated Mark, I found an expense that linked Lauren's department to a vendor tied to a class action suit, an exposure vector that could drag the company into a public scandal far larger than a single embezzlement. If the press smelled that, Vectorus wouldn't just lose a campaign. It would face lawsuits, investigations, and a share price that could plummet. This was not something I had intended. It was a discovery that changed the tenor of the fight. Up until now, everything had been proportional. A personal wound translated into professional consequences. But this new thread could become a wildfire. It could take their entire world with it, including me, because any fallout large enough to destroy Vectorus would not discriminate between perpetrators and observers. I had to decide. Did I want to burn the whole block to the ground to make them suffer, or did I want the fire contained? I realized in that moment that revenge is not merely about retribution. It's about control. Which parts of the ruin you allow to spread and which you smother. It was a calculus I had not fully considered when fury first lit the match. I chose control. I let the company learn first. I gave the auditors just enough to compel action and not collapse the firm instantly. I fed the reporter angles that emphasized corporate oversight rather than a larger industry exposure. I wanted the pain focused on the two people who had taken from me, not on the thousands of employees who had nothing to do with their choices. But there was one more move to make. The personal had to become personal again. Corporate investigations and press leaks were satisfying in their way, but they were also distant. They couldn't capture the small, human moments of shame I wanted them to feel. I wanted Lauren to realize, in a way that pierced deeper than humiliation, what she had broken. So I scheduled a meeting. I told her that a client wanted to see the work in person before the final audit. She came to the studio, our studio, once full of plans and laughter, now a quiet theater for things that would never return. I had set the room up like a confession. Notes on the table, layouts of the campaign, printouts of expense sheets, and a single envelope on a chair with her name on it. When she opened that envelope, she found what I had collected, not just the documents, but the photos of her and Mark in that parking garage, the timeline of her lies, the small receipts that added up to betrayal. She sat down slowly, the color draining from her face until the room looked like a black and white photograph. She looked at me and for a long time could not speak. I could see then, the precise moment her belief in inevitability was replaced by the chilling realization that someone had been watching, thinking, deciding. "You did all this," she whispered. There was no accusation left in her voice, only recognition. "I did what I had to," I told her. She laughed then, a raw bark that did not reach her eyes. "You think this makes you whole?" No, it did not. Nothing would. But I wanted them to understand what I had felt when I sat in my car in that parking lot, an ember in my chest that refused to go out. I wanted them to feel the weight of that ember now lodged in their own throats. She reached for her phone. I saw it and knew there would be more calls, more denials, more pleading. But in that moment, the room held only one sound, the drip of a leaky faucet, regular and inexorable, like the timeline of what I had begun. When she left, she turned once at the door and looked at me as if I were a stranger who had stolen something I could never give back. The look was not of hatred. It was the look of someone who had been measured and found wanting. Outside, rain began to fall. washing the city clean in a way that felt like a bad metaphor. I stayed in the studio until the light left the windows and the street lamps smeared the pavement into ink. I made a list of the next moves, who to call, what to leak, which clients to nudge. The list was clinical, a spreadsheet of hurts. At the bottom I wrote one line: keep balance. Do not burn the whole city. And then I sat alone, thinking of the moment I had promised myself I would never become, a man consumed by a plan he could not stop, waiting for the last domino to fall. For weeks I had felt like a surgeon standing over an operating table with the lights too bright and the heartbeat monitor counting down. I had planned, prodded, and nudged the architecture of their ruin into place. Now came the part I'd been both dreading and craving, the actual cut. I did not expect it to feel cinematic. Revenge rarely does. It is messier, slower, more granular than movies let on. It's the accumulation of small, chosen cruelties that compound into catastrophe. Each action I took that week was measured, like a series of calculated incisions. First, Mark. His suspension translated into guilt, then panic, then anger. He tried to fight it with bravado, at first loud calls that sounded like defenses, but loudness is a poor substitute for evidence. The shell company trail I'd unearthed had a paper-length reach. The auditors came with requests and subpoenas, and Mark began to stumble. I delivered one small, guaranteed blow. I arranged for a former subcontractor, someone who had been stiffed on a late invoice, to speak directly with Vector's his compliance head. I did not tell the man why it mattered so much. I only told him the truth about his unpaid work and gave him the context he needed to be angry in public. It was the kind of thing that makes people show up at a meeting room and ask hard questions. When Mark walked into that meeting, he looked like a man in the wrong suit. He tried to charm his way through, but charm has no currency when there's paper with a bank transfer attached. His face went from pink to an ashen hue as the numbers were read aloud. I watched the live feed of the meeting. Legal had set up the call from our shared architectural firm connection, feeling something cold and precise coil through my chest. He made no threats. He had no alibi. In under an hour, his career narrowed to a single terrified line. Then Lauren. She was the tougher target. Women like her are often more careful with their faces, with the way they script apologies, with the way they manufacture empathy. Her betrayal had been intimate, a fracture in the private domain, and private betrayals are harder to expose without seeming petty. But she had made a crucial mistake. She continued to speak to the wrong people in the wrong way. At a staff meeting I could not attend because discretion bred trust among colleagues, I had an ally, a junior account executive who had once confided in me over coffee about being unsettled by Lauren's late nights. I fed him a carefully worded account of the people who were asking the right questions. I suggested he keep copies of meeting notes, of email threads. He did. He uploaded them to a secure shared drive that legal now had access to. The trail thickened, but what I wanted wasn't only professional undoing. I wanted the slow, personal collapse. So I orchestrated small moments of intimacy turned public in such a way that humiliation would compound with career damage. I sent an anonymous note to a prominent creative director at a rival firm, someone who had once sniped at Vectors for sloppy work, hinting that Lauren's account practices were up for review and that the campaign's creative backbone had been compromised. The director, sensing an advantage, lent a questioning eye to any public deliverables. Clients pulled away. Meetings dragged on with fewer attendees. Lauren's calendar, which I had once watched bloom with opportunities, withered like a plant in the dark. It's funny what you notice when you watch someone's life fall apart. The small rituals that make up a person: the coffee order, the way they tuck their hair behind an ear, the way they say sorry as a reflex, become tiny relics of a past self. I cataloged these things almost scientifically. I wrote them down in a leather notebook I kept on the table by the window. Each line was a data point. Each data point was a small pleasure, And then there were the messages. I could have burned them. I could have released them to the world in a single, glorious blaze. But I wanted a different cruelty. I wanted the slow poison of truth, unleashed not as an explosion but as a series of perfectly timed reveals. So I scheduled deliveries. First, a package to Lauren's mother, an itemized printout of a portion of Lauren's involvement in the campaign, sent with an anonymous note. You should know what she's been doing. Then, a text to an ex of Mark's, an old flame who had been humiliated years ago, containing a single screenshot. Old embarrassments have a habit of reanimating old resentments. People find strange comfort in aligning themselves to a narrative that makes the present make sense. The small eruptions became a public tremor. Lauren's family called. Mark's ex posted a bitter thread that others piled onto. The internet, where anger seeks purchase, chewed and spat. But still, it was clinical. It felt like afflicting in the way of mathematics, not malevolence, until the phone call that changed everything. It was a number I didn't recognize. I let it ring twice, then 3 times. My thumb hovered over decline, and yet I answered. People who have done what I had done know the sound of their own voice in those early calls. Steady, composed, practiced. This voice answered the line, Ethan Cole. The voice was soft, unfamiliar, and it carried an edge of someone who had read the morning's news. Yes, I said, my name is Rachel Briggs. I'm with the state attorney's office. We've been looking into Vectorus for a while. I just wanted to ask you a few things about any involvement you might have had with the company. My stomach narrowed. That word, involvement, carried more weight than knowledge. It implied legal gravity. I'm a client. Architecture firm, I said, keeping my words small, defensive. I had a contract with them last year. She made a sound that could have been a concession. Do you know a Mark Keller? I almost laughed. Do I know a Mark Keller? I know enough. There was a pause, the kind that suggests the person on the other end is computing risk. Mr. Cole, I should be direct. We've had an anonymous tip linking some irregular expenditures to Vectorus. We're opening inquiries into potential embezzlement. I'd like to meet. For now, your cooperation would be appreciated. I agreed to meet because men like me always assume they can wedge themselves between consequence and outcome. I told myself I'd be careful, that I'd keep my distance. But the meeting with Rachel was not a simple inquiry. It felt like a probe into the wiring of something larger than I'd anticipated. She did not have the names. She had the shape of the problem. A company with a questionable vendor trail, a campaign at risk, and a series of individuals who had been acting strangely. She asked if there were any other irregularities. I had noticed phrases meant to capture context beyond the immediate ledger. I left her office that afternoon with a business card and a quiet tremor of possibility moving like an insect under my skin. Her call had introduced an axis I had not planned to tilt, the legal arm. I had been careful to keep everything anonymous and plausible, but now an authority with subpoena power existed on the same plane as my plan. It made the game far less theatrical and far more dangerous. That night I sat in the studio, and for the first time in months, I felt doubt. Not the kind that unravels a plan, more the kind that points at consequences you had not anticipated. If the Attorney General's office came down hard enough, Vectorus could crumble. That would ruin thousands of people who had nothing to do with the affair. It would also pull people like me into swirl, not because I deserved it, but because investigations have a way of touching everyone connected. A tumble of effect. I could have halted then, backed away and let corporate compliance and guilty consciences do the rest. But by then something else had taken root in me, a pleasure in the precision of consequence. I had seen the way Mark's face went pale in a meeting. I had seen Lauren's fingers tremble as she paged through printouts in my studio. I had watched the people who had treated her as collateral begin to shrink away. There was cruelty in the control. There was also admitted a reassertion of power. I would not take this back. So I moved forward, and I moved faster. I arranged for a carefully anonymous data drop to a journalist with an appetite for corporate scandal. The package contained invoices, emails, and the schematic of the shell company. It was a tidy, unassailable bundle. It read like a leak prepared by someone who wanted truth but also wanted consequence. The reporter, thrilled, set about verifying. Within 48 hours, the piece ran with a headline that made my chest hum with a terrible satisfaction. Vector's under investigation. Alleged misuse of client funds and vendor fraud. The internet lit, the stock dipped. Investors tweeted their anxieties. Clients called their attorneys. HR called Lauren and told her to expect subpoenas. She called me the night the article ran. Her voice was all the things I had missed in the months since. Sharp, accusatory, vulnerable. She said things like, "You don't understand what this means for me, and you've destroyed everything." When she said "you," it landed like a hammer. I thought of the night I had watched them in the parking garage, and how small and bright a betrayal had been. She didn't say "I'm sorry." She never did. She said instead, "Do you have any idea what you've done?" The truth is I did, and I did not regret the precise cruelty of it. But I felt, suddenly and with an odd clarity, the first ache of consequences that might rebound. The day after the article, Mark was arrested. It was quiet. No theatrics, no cuffs in front of cameras. He was taken in for questioning and later booked on charges related to wire fraud. The photographs of him in the paper the following morning were unflattering. He looked smaller than he had in person, and his mouth had the shape of someone who had just been told a story he could not rewrite. Lauren came to my studio then, uninvited. She had a black hole under each eye and a stiffness to her movements, as if she was trying to keep her body from betraying herself. She said things in that visit that were neither confession nor defense, but the raw flapping of someone trying to catch air. "I didn't think he'd," she stammered. "I didn't realize the invoices. He handled the books, Ethan. I signed things." She looked like she believed it, and also like she didn't want to fully be believed. "You slept with him," I said simply. It was a sentence I had rehearsed less than the others, but it had the crispness of inevitability. She flinched as if I'd slapped her. "Yes," she said. "But listen, there's more. You don't understand the pressure. The campaign, if it failed, people would lose jobs." Her voice broke on that word. At that moment she stopped sounding like the sophisticated marketing director and more like someone I had once loved on a couch in the dim winter light. "And what does that mean?" I asked. "That what you did was justified. That makes it worse." She reached for my hand as if for support. I let her, then pulled away. The contact felt like a counterfeit forgiveness. "You don't have to do this," she whispered. "You could just walk away. We could try to." "You expect me to walk away?" I said. The edge in my voice surprised me. "You expect me to pretend none of this happened? After what I watched? After everything?" She did the only thing people do when they are cornered. She offered a future as a salve for a present wound. "We can leave the city. Start over. I'll resign." "Oh," she stopped. The list of sacrifices dried on her lips. "And what about Mark?" I said. "What about the people who were hurt? Even if you claim ignorance, you could have told me." "I was ashamed," she said. "I was scared." Shame and fear do not absolve. They are excuses fashioned from soft materials that cannot hold the weight of deceit. I told her as much, and she left with nothing but a small suitcase and a look that said she had once believed in a story that no longer existed. After she left, I felt the room like an empty building. The plan had been executed precisely, the expected casualties in place, yet the endgame, whatever that meant, felt oddly hollow. I had wanted to make them understand the way betrayal feels, to register the same ruin I'd felt inside their lives. They understood now. Understanding, though, doesn't equate to repair. And then came the thing I did not expect. A faint knock at my front door at 2:17 a.m. That time of night is a bad time for visitors. My phone lay face up on the kitchen counter, the screen dark. For a beat I thought it might be Mark, trying to beg or to threaten. For another beat I thought it might be a neighbor, mistakenly at my place because of the storm drains flooding the street. I opened the door to find a woman in a plain coat, rain beating on her hair. She looked younger than me by a decade but older in the way grief ages people. "Mr. Cole?" she asked. "Yes? I'm sorry to wake you. My name is Anna Klein. I work with Rachel Briggs at the attorney's office." Her voice was the soft professionalism of someone delivering bad news. I stepped aside. She came in single file, leaving wet footprints on my hall rug. I offered coffee. I did not mean to drink. She accepted. Her hands were trembling. "We've been looking into Vector's books," she said. "Thank you for your cooperation so far. But something more has come up. There's been an allegation. A separate matter involving potential obstruction of justice." My mouth went dry. "Obstruction?" "Yes. We've received reports that certain evidence appears to have been funneled to us through anonymous channels, and that some of those channels may have been manipulated to look like leaks rather than internal audits. We want to be thorough, Mr. Cole. If you have any reason to believe you were involved in any way that could be construed as interfering with documents or with company operations, now is the time to tell us." A cold wind rose in me, not from the rain but from the sense that my tidy plan had found jagged edges. "I did not obstruct anything," I said quickly. "I sent information anonymously, but I never altered documents. I gathered public filings and emails. That's all." She nodded as if she had heard similar defenses before. "Gathering publicly available information is one thing. Creating narratives that cause financial harm is another. We have to ask about intent, Mr. Cole." "Intent?" The word landed like an indictment. In that single syllable, my actions meticulously planned, emotionally driven, were reframed as something criminally purposeful. Anna sipped her coffee. She did not look at me as a neighbor or as a lover wronged. She looked at me with the curiosity of someone scanning the surface for heat. "You're not under arrest," she said finally. "But I have to ask you to be available. We may have further questions. For your own sake, be candid." When she left, the rain had picked up, and the city sounded like a drum. I locked the door and sat on the couch, the leather cool under my weight. For the first time since I'd seen them in that parking garage, I felt fear not of them, but of what an official hammer might do. Authority flattens nuance. It grinds motive into a single legal term and renders your best reasons into confessions you hadn't intended to make. I had wanted them to suffer. I had not wanted to be the instrument that would make them and possibly me legally untouchable. On the table in front of me lay the leather notebook with the list of moves I had made. The last line I'd written that night before the knock read, "Stay precise. Stay out of the light." Now the light had arrived. Somewhere beyond my living room walls, the city flickered with the fallout of what I'd done. My phone buzzed 3 messages from unknown numbers, 1 email from an unlisted account with an attachment I did not open. I reached for it, then did not. There are things you open only when prepared to deal with the consequences. I thought of Mark in a cell, of Lauren packing a suitcase, of the junior account executive who had dutifully uploaded meeting notes and now might be a witness. I thought of Rachel Briggs, Anna Klein, and the cold, procedural curiosity in their eyes. I thought of the private, quiet cruelty I had inflicted, and the way it had looped back toward me like a tide-colored mirror. Then my phone lit up with a single message from an unknown private number. "We need to talk. You went too far." In the letter was enough to knock my stomach. My mind raced through possibilities. Mark, a desperate ally, someone else with a name beginning in that letter, a threat. I had been careful, surgical, and yet here in the rain, with the legal arm moving in, and the mess I'd made taking on the weight of unintended consequences, precision felt like a lie. I opened the message again. It was simple. No location, no time, just the terse, "We need to talk." Outside, the city hummed with traffic and news vans and a rain that did not seem willing to stop. Inside, My living room felt suddenly like a courtroom. I thought of all the ways a man convinces himself he's in control until the ledger proves otherwise. I found myself standing, the way you stand when you realize the play you're in is changing scenes without your consent. I grabbed my jacket. If I had learned anything in the weeks since the parking lot, it was that plans have a way of being colonized by new facts. If someone wanted to talk someone with the initial M or another actor entirely, I had a duty to know what they wanted. Whether it would be confession, blackmail, or threat, I could not know. I locked the door and stepped out into the rain. The streetlight cast my shadow long behind me. The city smelled of wet asphalt and fear. The game I had made was changing rules, and I was no longer sure who the players were. The rain had washed the city into a smear of sodium lights and tired neon. I stood under a flickering street lamp with my collar turned up and my jacket clinging to my shoulders like a guilty thing. The message on my phone, "We need to talk. You went too far," and had been a simple sentence, but it carried the weight of a fuse. Whoever was, they had watched the dominoes fall and decided they had a stake in where the line stopped. The agreed meeting point was a diner that still served $3 coffee and pretended it hadn't noticed the world change around it. I sat in a booth with my back to the window, the kind of seat that affords a man the illusion of safety. I ordered black coffee and let the steam fog my glasses while I wondered which of the plausible ends might walk through the door. Mark's voice, if alive and vindictive, would carry a desperate bluntness. Mason, the name I had only heard in whispers, a local investor who'd been cozy with Vector's his board, would carry a colder, velvet threat. Maybe it was simply someone with a vendetta, some loose end I hadn't considered. Shigash, no. He sat down across from me without introduction. He removed his hood with a movement that suggested he wanted to be seen. Mid-30s by the look of him, careful stubble, eyes a shade too practiced for comfort. He smiled like a man who keeps his options. "You're Ethan Cole," he said, like a sentence someone had preprinted and handed him. "Yes, I'm Marcus Reed." The name fit a face that could own a townhouse or a hard-drinking bar, depending on which city he chose. "You ruined a lot of people's nights, Mr. Cole." "Depends whose nights," I said. "Depends what you mean by ruined." He took his time answering. "Mark's in custody. Lauren's reputation is collapsing. Vector's is bleeding clients. Their board is panicking. That's ruin." He leaned in. "You think you're the only judge in town. You think you have the right to pull levers on an entire company because you felt slighted." I felt the old urge to justify myself, to tell the whole truth, and hope it would make the weight lighter. But I had learned that truth, spoken, is a kind of currency you cannot retrieve. I kept my hands wrapped around the warm coffee and let the steam fall between us. "I don't have to think anything," I said. "I saw them. I found evidence. I pushed it. They deserve to be held accountable." Marcus laughed, but it was a thin sound. "You saw a kiss in a parking garage and decided to collapse careers. Do you understand how that looks to a board responding to a crisis? It looks like one man with a vendetta timed perfectly to coincide with real, complicated financial problems. You made yourself an actor in a greater play." "So what?" I started. "So what," Marcus interrupted, "is that you are collateral now. Your little rebellion has an effect nobody predicted. The AG's office is sniffing around their books and finding patterns that go higher than Mark. They're getting close to names bigger than you or me. People who don't like instability." His voice dropped to an almost conspiratorial register. "I'm not here for moralizing, Mr. Cole. I'm here because you've stepped on a wire that leads to people who will step back on you if they think you're a liability." "You mean extortion?" I said. He shrugged. "Call it what you like. I'm an intermediary. I can make this quiet. I can make the fallout small. Or I can make sure the AG thinks you were more involved than you actually were. You sent anonymous packages, right? You thought the masks would protect you?" A long silence sat between us. I thought of Anna Klein and Rachel Briggs with their careful questions, and the way legal language makes murder of motive with one word: intent. I thought of the leather notebook and the list of moves I had made, like a mood board for demolition. Marcus was saying what I'd been trying not to say to myself, that my precision had not been an invisible scalpel but a bright flare. "What do you want?" I asked finally. He smiled without humor. "Cooperation. A public retraction from the source. You walk back some of this, admit you were acting on unverified suspicions, and Vector's board will be a lot easier on Lauren. Mark still pays for what he did, but the exposure can be contained. People keep their jobs. Investors don't panic. The papers cool off. And in exchange?" I asked. "In exchange, I make sure the G's inquiry doesn't widen. I pull strings. I have friends." He said that last sentence the way men who own favors say them. "Help us spin the narrative, Mr. Cole. Help us avoid a systemic collapse." The proposition was made politely, like a salesman offering seats on a yacht, as though ruin could be parceled and distributed with a ledger. The moral calculus of it made my mouth taste like pennies. I had wanted justice, or at least retribution, for the intimate violation of trust. Now I was being asked to trade that intensity for a ledger's balance: more lives saved, but also the scent of a larger compromise. "You realize I won't be the one who decides that," I said. "I don't get to bargain on behalf of Vector's or their board." "No," Marcus agreed. "But you can help. A statement here, a seeded rumor there. Help us make this a scandal about a couple bad apples instead of a rot in the cellar. Or we make it wider. We involve the SEC, or the press does, and they paint you as the arsonist." It was a threat sitting in an affable suit. If I refused, the lever would be pulled the other way. My role would be simplified. Villain. The ad would treat me as more than a witness, and the legal machinery I had cautiously avoided would not be sympathetic to a man with a notebook full of vendetta. Marcus slid a card across the table. "No company, just a number. Think about it. We're not monsters, Ethan. We're just people who prefer the house not burn." I pocketed the card. The choice felt like choosing which bone to break to stop a worse pain. I walked out of the diner feeling the city tilt under my feet. Marcus's warning nested with Anna's request for candor, and with the small, insistent voice inside me that had insisted on proportionality from the first moment I'd watched them in that parking garage. I had wanted them to feel the ruin I had felt, but did I want to become the architect of mass ruin? Or a man who draws a line and refuses to compromise? I slept for a few hours and dreamt in cheap monochrome. When I woke, I had an odd, brittle clarity. If Marcus wanted a bargaining chip, I'd give him one, but on terms he hadn't considered. I would make him and the people he represented exposed just as surely as I had made Mark and Lauren feel exposed. They had underestimated me if they thought I would be easily cajoled. I had been surgical. Now I would be stubborn. I began to look for the node Marcus had hinted at: the person who connected the shell company, the investor, and the board. If I could show that the rot reached beyond Mark and Lauren, then Marcus and his friends would be forced to choose between protecting the guilty or protecting themselves, and once they had to choose, the option to quietly bury things would be harder to maintain. The first hint I followed led me to a name I had only seen in passing: Hilver Consulting, the shell that had nulled invoices. It had been registered in the name of a woman who had a paper trail of little businesses, all of them thin and convenient. But the bank account where the transfers landed had another name on it: Reed Ventures. Reed. I felt the chill that comes when a pattern finally pulls tight. Marcus had said he was Marcus Reed. The spelling differed, but the city had a way of hiding the same family under different facades. I dug deeper, combing public records, following corporate filings, and cross-referencing lobbyist registrations. It wasn't long before I found a string of donations, board memberships, and a name that reappeared in the predictable spaces of influence: Mason Reed, investor, philanthropist. Man who owns favors like some men collect suits. Marcus had been a messenger. Mason was the hand on the scale. It would have been one thing to expose Mason with a blog post or an anonymous package. It would have been another to put him in a room where he couldn't call in favors to quiet the noise. I needed a stage, and I needed witnesses. The AG's office had subpoena power. The press had appetite, and investors had egos that could be pried open with the right jolt. So I began constructing a compromise of my own. If Marcus wanted a retraction, I would give him a retraction, but only after a public, transparent hearing where the whole truth could be aired, not quietly negotiated behind closed doors. I would push for a town hall-style meeting with Vectrus's board and their major clients. I would invite the reporter who had first run the piece, and I would invite Rachel Briggs and Anna Klein to sit in the room. I would ensure that the AG's office could not be silenced by a card in someone's pocket. To pull that off, I needed leverage that could not be easily bought, proof that Reed Ventures profited from the same shell companies that had been draining Vector's funds. I needed bank trails, deposit slips, and names of people who had been paid to look the other way. I needed a clean bundle of evidence that would make Mason's friends think twice about buying quiet. I built Betrayal like a man assembling a model bridge, careful, exact, careful about balance. I called an old colleague at a small accounting firm who owed me a favor years ago. I had helped a partner's friend with a permit, and I asked for help tracing transaction origins. She scoffed at first, then listened, then worked the angles, while I gathered the public filings and invoices. We found a series of thin transfers, payments split into tiny amounts, routed through accounts into states, then consolidated into a Reed Ventures holding. It was enough to show flow, not yet criminality, but it tightened the narrative. That night I drafted an email to the reporter who had run the first piece. I wrote with the detached specificity I'd come to favor, links, screenshots, chain of custody notes. I asked for a meeting. The reply came back within an hour. When it felt like the city saturated in rain and ruin had a new axis. Mason Reed had been sloppy in public appearance and surgical in private. If I could bring him into the light, Marcus's polite threat would lose its point. Who would buy a quiet if the quiet made the house burns larger and faster? Marcus wanted containment. I wanted exposure. The day before the meeting I walked past Vectrus's lobby and watched the building through the glass. People moving like coagulated shadows. Collars up against the same rain, faces drawn with the weight of borrowed panic. I thought of Lord jittering under the weight of calls. I thought of Mark behind bars. I thought of the list at the bottom of my notebook. Keep balance. Do not burn the whole city. Balance had become a hard word to hold. I sent the reporter the final bundle, and then, with a steadier pulse than I felt, I called Marcus. I have something you'll want to see, I said. Let's talk. He agreed, predictably. His voice had the same airy politeness as before, but there was a tremor beneath it. He had the sense of a man who could smell the wind changing. When we met, I slid a folder across the table. The slip of paper that fell from the center had a bank routing number and a series of dates. Marcus's face changed the way a person's face changes when they realize a play has been called. We can still make it quiet, he said, fingers fidgeting with the corner of the folder. You don't want what comes next. We'll see, I said. Outside, the rain continued as if it had no opinion on justice, on bargains, on the small, terrible satisfactions of revenge. Inside, in the confines of a booth, two men who both preferred order to chaos weighed options with the tiredness of men who had been up too long. You know why I'm here, Marcus said. I do, I said. You want to keep the house from burning, and you? He asked. You want what? I thought of the parking garage and the slow, deliberate kiss that had cracked everything open. I thought of the way love had been braided with lies, and how the braid had come apart in my hands. I thought too of the AG's polite questions, and the way authority flattens nuance into law. I want them to know, I said. All of them, not just the cheap lovers, but the men who buy silence with accounting entries, and polite calls. If we're going to trade anything, we trade it in the light. He laughed, a quick, incredulous sound. You want to torch friends, Ethan. You want corporate warfare. I want accountability, I said. Same thing to different people, he replied. And you want to be the judge. Be careful. Judges need rogues. Men like you get subpoenas. He left the folder with me and vanished into the rain. The folder felt heavier than the days that had preceded it, as though the truth inside it were a weight I'd invited. That night I sat with the documents spread across my dining table like a map. Each line showed a payment, each payment a name, each name a connection. I had been precise. Now the precision had produced a new, jagged vector, a choice between the quiet Marcus offered and the public reckoning I had begun to taste. Outside, the city hummed. Inside, I heard a single question keep rattling my ribs. Was this revenge, or was it justice dressed up like revenge so I could sleep? When the phone lit up with a message from the reporter, we run tomorrow. Be ready. I felt the cold clarity of the blade before the strike. The next morning would not be quiet. The next morning would be loud, public, and irrevocable. I would either pull the thread that might undo more than I intended, or I would accept the bargain and let the house settle. Either way, the line had been crossed. There was no going back. Morning came sharp and cold, the kind of gray that presses against your eyelids even before you open them. I'd barely slept. The city outside was washed in rain and headlights, that washed-out glow that makes everything look unreal, as if the world is waiting to see what kind of day it's going to. The story broke at 6:42 and it was on every major outlet by 7:15. Vectorus implodes amid corruption scandal. Internal evidence points to high-level cover-up. My name was buried deep in the article, not as a whistleblower, but as an unnamed source close to the investigation. That was how Rachel and Anna had agreed to frame it. The article didn't mention Lauren. It didn't mention Mark. Not yet. But the people who mattered, the ones who lived and breathed that company, they knew. By 8 o'clock, my phone was vibrating off the counter. Lauren called first, 3 times. Then came the messages. Ethan, what did you do? Then, you don't understand what's happening. Please answer me. I didn't. I sat at my kitchen table, coffee untouched, listening to the rain slide down the window. The apartment felt foreign, like a place I'd moved into but hadn't unpacked. The silence was heavier than anything I'd felt since that night in the parking garage. Back then, the pain had been personal, sharp, and simple. Now it was something else. The ache of realizing that even justice has collateral damage. By noon, the egg's office released a statement confirming an official investigation into Vector's financial practices and shell subsidiaries. The words were bureaucratic, but the meaning was nuclear. Mason Reed, the man Marcus had tried to protect, was listed as a person of interest. That was the point. I understood. I'd won. And yet, I didn't feel anything that resembled victory. Around 2 p.m., there was a knock on my door. When I opened it, Marcus stood there. No pretense this time. His coat was soaked, his expression unreadable. He looked less like a man delivering threats and more like one attending a funeral he didn't want to admit was his own. Mind if I come in? He asked. I stepped aside. He walked in, glanced at the papers on my counter, the printed article, the screenshots, the half-empty mug, then back at me. You really went through with it, he said quietly. I told you I would. He nodded, jaw tightening. You understand what happens now? I think so, he sighed, rubbing his temples. You think Mason was the end of it. Mason's just one head. You've set fire to a nest, Ethan. There are people with money, power, and very little tolerance for exposure. They won't come at you through lawyers anymore. They'll come through people like me, except not as polite. Then maybe you shouldn't have come, I said. I came because I wanted to see what kind of man would do it, he replied. You've got the look of someone who just realized revenge and righteousness are the same drug. You get high on both, but the crash is the same. He turned toward the window. They'll eat each other before this is over. Mason will fall, the board will fracture, Vectorus will be picked apart by vultures. The city will move on. But you will still be here looking at the ashes. I didn't answer. Marcus looked back at me, his expression softening just a little. You ever think she might have just been human? That maybe you both were. I laughed, but there was no humor in it. You mean, do I regret it? Do you? I thought about that for a long time. About Lauren, her laugh, her eyes, the way she used to trace her fingers along my collarbone when she thought I was asleep. About the small moments before everything turned. Then I said, no, I regret believing she wouldn't hurt me. But I don't regret showing her what it feels like. Marcus didn't reply. He just nodded slowly, as if filing that away somewhere private. When he finally left, he didn't threaten me again. He just said one last thing before the door closed behind him. Be careful what peace you think you've earned. Sometimes the quiet that follows isn't peace, it's fallout. The weeks that followed were a blur of headlines and depositions. Vectorus collapsed within a month. Mason Reed was indicted. Several executives resigned under pressure. The city's financial circles buzzed like a hive kicked open. Lauren disappeared from the public eye. She quit her job, deleted her socials, moved out of her apartment. Someone told me she was staying with her sister in Portland. I never checked. Mark took a plea deal. 6 months in a white-collar facility. The irony wasn't lost on me. He'd always been the kind of man who thought he could talk his way out of anything. Maybe he still could. As for me, the police interviewed me twice. These people once. I told the truth. Most of it, anyway. They thanked me for my cooperation. That was the word they used. It sounded like something between appreciation and suspicion. After that, the city grew quiet again. Too quiet. One night, maybe 2 months after the story broke, I drove past the hotel, the one where it all started. The parking lot was empty except for the hum of neon and the reflection of my own headlights. I parked and sat there for a long time. I tried to picture that night again, the way they had looked at each other, the way I had felt everything inside me crack and harden. I wondered if I'd have done it all the same way, knowing how far it would go, knowing how much it would cost. Probably, I thought. Maybe even faster. Revenge doesn't give you back what was taken, it just changes who owns the pain. I watched the rain slide down the windshield. 1,000 tiny mirrors breaking apart the same reflection. For the first time in months, I let myself say her name out loud. Lauren. It didn't hurt the way it used to. It didn't heal, either. It just existed, a sound that once meant something, now hollow and tired. I left Seattle a week later, packed a few bags, sold my condo, and drove south until the city lights were behind me. I didn't have a destination. Maybe I still don't, but as the miles blurred and the rain thinned into sunlight, I realized something. I'd built a life on design, on blueprints, structure, and control. And for the first time, I'd torn something down completely and let it stay broken. Maybe that was the real ending. Not victory, not closure, just stillness. Sometimes that's enough.